This was not supposed to happen. The world's largest nuclear power got the old Uno reverse card played on it, and now finds itself the target of a Ukrainian invasion. And to add to the shock, it marks the first time that Russian land is being held by a foreign occupier since World War II, which also means that it is the first time that it has happened since Moscow developed nuclear weapons. And for all of the nuclear rhetoric from earlier in this war, atomic bombs feel like a mere footnote in the main story today. So, what the heck happened to nuclear deterrence? Why wasn't Zelensky stopped by nightmares of mushroom clouds over Kyiv? And why hasn't Moscow fired away as a warning to others who think that its nuclear rhetoric is just a bluff? Well, it turns out that nothing happened to nuclear deterrence. In fact, nuclear deterrence is still working exactly as it has all along. It is just that the world's biggest bombs were never shields of invincibility. Ukraine is breaking a barrier that was never there to begin with. So today, we will discuss what Russia has in its nuclear stockpile that was supposed to strike fear in Kyiv, the general global norms against nuclear weapons use, Russia's more specific problems with its partners, hey guys, the historical failures of nuclear weapons as perfect deterrence, why deterrence in Kursk failed in particular, and where nuclear weapons may start to enter the picture once again. But we begin with Russia's nuclear stockpile. Again, nuclear weapons have been a part of the B-plot consistently throughout this war. There are endless articles on the subject, and I have published a bunch of videos about it as well, though most of them are me being annoyed with those aforementioned articles. And, on the surface, all of this is understandable. Russia has about 5,600 of them, beating the United States by a healthy margin, and way out ahead of China, France, and the United Kingdom. Of the Russian arsenal, about 1,700 of them are ready to go, 2,700 are in storage and could be made ready relatively quickly, and another 1,200 are ready to be decommissioned, but could still potentially be fixed. These are guesses, of course. True numbers are an intelligence agency's game. But it is not like those specific numbers matter much. Ukraine has 0, and Kyiv never had operational control of the nuclear weapons that sat on its soil during and in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Moreover, Russia possesses the same full strategic triad of nuclear delivery systems that the United States has: fighters or bombers to drop them, intercontinental ballistic missiles to take a short detour to space before raining down fire, and submarines to hide until the moment is right. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 of them are tactical nuclear weapons, which tend to be smaller than their strategic nuclear weapon brothers. Their purpose is to be used on the battlefield against military targets, rather than turn the world population centers into radioactive barbecues. More on them toward the end of this video. Here's the thing, though. There are global norms about nuclear weapons, and Ukraine seems unimpressed with all of that big atomic energy. It would be tempting to think that the ability to end life on Earth as we know it many times over would force one's opposition to bend over backward to appease its geopolitical master. But life is more complicated than that. While the world's superpower, the other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, 2 bitter rivals, and 2 much smaller countries, were busy building nuclear armaments, most of the rest of the world decided that nuclear weapons were evil, and even their possessors and those who directly benefit from a patron's nuclear umbrella have adopted a philosophy that friendly nuclear weapons are okay, but everyone else's are morally wrong. This gave rise to a host of international institutions. The best known is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which bans the development of nuclear weapons, but hypocritically permits the Security Council's permanent members to keep theirs. But then again, that is why the treaty aims to stop proliferation, that is, expansion, rather than aiming for destruction. Going a step further, various nuclear weapon-free zones ban the transit and stationing of nuclear weapons in those areas. And, in my humble opinion, is much preferable to a free nuclear weapon zone. Meanwhile, the upstart Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons aims to remove that strange carve-out from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then you have the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which limits tests to locations underground so as to contain the fallout. And the next level to that is the not yet in force Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which, well, comprehensively bans testing. As a result, each of these countries can press the proverbial red button if they want to, but they first ought to consider the fallout, specifically the political fallout. For Russia right now, its specific political problem lies to Moscow's east. Both China and India fall into the camp of, my nukes are fine, but at yours I draw the line. And both are tacit but critical partners in this invasion. While most of the economic powerhouses turned off their spigots to Russian oil and gas, China and India chose to remain open. And it is the cash sent back to Moscow that keeps the war going. Last time, we discussed how the Kursk invasion is a consequence of Russia's limited budget. You see, long ago, the Kremlin decided that conscription was too politically risky, and so voluntary contracts have become the primary method of recruitment for the war. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, though, the trade-off here is that you actually have to pay those soldiers. And as the war has acquired a reputation as being a good place to lose life and limb, the contracts have had to go up to cover the soldiers' risk premium. Absent an unlimited budget, the Kremlin had to cut costs somewhere. That place was the border, leading Ukraine to invite itself over for some chaos in Kursk. Now, I cannot say definitively how Modi or Xi would react to the end of days, but the answer is probably not well. Indeed, there have been various reports that Modi and Xi have talked Putin down from the ledge, or at least told him to never get on that ledge in the first place. I also cannot tell you exactly what convinced Putin, but I am reasonably confident that Modi was not threatening to stop playing golf with him, and Xi was not threatening to repatriate all of the pandas in Russia. No, if you want to scare Putin out of using nuclear weapons, you want to hit him where it hurts, which, in this case, is the pocketbook. So unless a few nuclear weapons would rapidly induce Kyiv's capitulation, the atomic avenue could ultimately have a detrimental effect on Russia's ability to win the war. Of course, there are nuclear optimists out there who would suggest that this is a real possibility. They are inclined to point to the 1945 bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the Pacific War as proof of concept. Now, trust me that we do not want to be sidetracked into the broader historical debate on that. But a big portion of Japan's decision to surrender is that the leadership believed that it would not be the end of Japan. The emperor would maintain his title, and the country would rebuild under a new government. There would be no extermination of Japanese culture, nor would the islands become the 49th state of America. Ukrainians, in contrast, anticipate that capitulation would mean integration with Russia, and with that, they worry that the scenes out of Bucha will become commonplace throughout the country. Thus, at some level, the decision between surrendering and suffering continued nuclear bombings results in annihilation one way or another. It is just a decision between timing and how much pain Ukrainian soldiers can inflict on Moscow in response. And even if a few fireballs would allow Russia to dictate some new borders, Moscow would still need to weigh the value of a few new oblasts versus forever becoming the world's pariah. In turn, the good game theorists back in Kyiv were working through these incentives. For the reasons cited above, nuclear retaliation was an unlikely response to an invasion, so they ignored that possibility, reasoned that invading was better than continually losing ground in the east, and pulled the trigger on the most consequential decision that the war has seen since 2022. However, again, this is nothing new. Although at some point nuclear weapons acquired some sort of mythical status, they never created an atomic wall along a country's borders. Indeed, countries with nuclear weapons tend to either have had peace along their borders for reasons completely unrelated to the bombs, or continue to have the conflicts keep going anyway? Let's start with the United States. As you know, it is sandwiched by Mexico and Canada. Neither of those countries has thought about invading the land of freedom since any of us has been alive. So, in the longest-running case, nuclear weapons did not substantively alter the picture there. Likewise, the United Kingdom is surrounded by the EU. London may have withdrawn from the organization many years ago, and it still gets a lot of funny looks from its continental friends. But again, nuclear weapons are not altering any invasion calculus. Of course, during the Cold War, both were focused more on the Soviet Union than anything else. But any light incursions first had to go through West Germany. Thus, the Cold War may provide some support for nuclear shield theory, but at the same time, the theory was not much put to the test. North Korea looks a little more promising because it seems like it has scared off South Korea, until you learn that South Korea has always been terrified of how North Korean artillery sits 23 kilometers away from Seoul. And really, the metro area bleeds all the way to the line. In any case, for decades before Pyongyang tested its first weapon, this fear was already deterring an invasion. China looks a lot better, where you have basically every country along its borders having some type of grievance about the lines on maps, but no major wars where China is the one getting invaded. Though perhaps the fact that all of those disagreements still exist tells you something. Then we get to India and Pakistan, and alarm bells should be going off. In 1999, after both countries possessed nuclear arsenals, Pakistan invaded Kargil, a remote area of Kashmir that India administered. Now, there is an argument that India's nukes canceled out Pakistan's collection. India could not bomb Islamabad without mortgaging New Delhi. It is an idea that we have explored previously regarding a war between China and the United States over Taiwan. So rather than getting lost in a mountain of debate there, maybe we should just skip to Israel, where the myth of nuclear invincibility really starts to fall apart. 3 areas that Israel has controlled at various times to varying degrees, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, are constantly fought over. But the dagger is the evolution of Egyptian war strategy, which will hint at what Ukraine can get away with today. From the day that Israel as a country came into being, Egypt had an explicit goal to remove its lines from the map. But by the late 1960s, Israel had used its nuclear facilities to fashion together its first bomb, even if it still remains Israeli policy to pretend like the bombs do not exist. Now, the nukes did not suddenly make Egypt fall in love with Israel. That took a while, and would probably be better described as Jimmy Carter gave them a ton of aid. However, it did force Egypt to rethink its war aims against Israel. Gone were the days of Egypt trying to run over Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. In came a more limited agenda. Indeed, Egypt's goal during the 1973 Yom Kippur War was to secure just the Sinai Peninsula. The bet was that Israel would be unwilling to incur international condemnation over an area that it had only administered since 1967. In contrast, nuclear weapons meant that attacking a capital or a major population center was off limits for Egypt. Policymakers in Cairo knew that Israel could endure endless rounds of criticism at the United Nations if it meant saving Jerusalem. Heck, nuclear weapons did not stop Chechnya from fighting a war against Russia, though whether a civil war should qualify as a self-invasion is up to you. Anyway, that takes us back to the limits of nuclear coercion in the Kursk offensive. You see, Kursk is on the Russian political periphery. Yes, the people who live there are Russian citizens, and unlike the Sinai to Israel, it is not a recent addition to the country. In fact, Kursk's history with Russia dates back to imperial times, and it is legendary in Russian history as the site of Germany's final offensive on the Eastern Front during World War II, which resulted in a major Soviet victory. It will even draw out Putin to commemorate the anniversary of the battle every now and then. Moreover, if a power vacuum formed in Moscow tomorrow, those citizens would not be clamoring to create the Kursk People's Republic. But you can see its lack of political centrality by both the scant defenses put in front of it and Moscow's slow response to the offensive. As a comparison, imagine that Finnish troops invaded Russia and quickly found themselves on the doorstep of St. Petersburg. Russia's response would be very different. Fast, forceful, and no frolicking around. In contrast, the Kremlin is addressing the crisis in Kursk while simultaneously trying to maintain a normal schedule. Something like business as usual. But it is hard to imagine that the Kremlin's website would be highlighting negotiations with Palestinian representatives if St. Petersburg were under siege. And that may be the greatest irony of nuclear deterrence. They do not help with the things that are hard to gather political support to defend. Of course, that does not mean that nuclear weapons are worthless. After all, it is nice to have an insurance policy for the things that you care about the most. But nuclear weapons are not a panacea for all of a country's security needs. Now, aside from that, it also stands to reason that they will never come into the picture during Ukraine's offensive due to practical constraints. Yes, Ukraine's advance into Kursk has been rapid. Nevertheless, on the grand scheme of things, its progress into Russia is small. It is doubtful that Ukraine has the logistical ability to get deep enough into Russia, where the nuclear line is drawn. That is, where the periphery starts to become the core. Or at least we think so. Who knows what Ukraine is up to at this point. However, we should end with a bit of a warning. This video is not suggesting that Kursk is the beginning of Ukraine's nuclear-free parade to victory. There remains room for Russia to calculate that true nuclear escalation is worth the gamble, even if it will cause some consternation in Beijing and New Delhi. But do not expect Kyiv to start having bombs raining down on it. There are some intermediary steps that would come prior to us waving goodbye to what they will eventually call the before times. Rather than jumping straight to strategic nuclear weapons use, Russia could go with a tactical nuclear surprise. Interestingly, though, Moscow's options there are limited. The thing is, you really do not want to blow up nuclear weapons on territory that you aim to administer. Now, thanks to the physics of explosions, nuclear bombs are not nearly as problematic as power plant disasters like Chernobyl. You see, if you detonate a bomb on the ground, a good portion of its concussive force will immediately get absorbed into the earth. Consequently, to maximize the damage, it is best to detonate above the ground. For example, this is the Nagasaki bomb from earlier. It triggered at 0.5 kilometer. Larger yields should go to even higher altitudes, sometimes kilometers above ground zero. This is how structures at the center of a blast can remain standing. They might not immediately incinerate. Instead, they may take the explosion as downward pressure and transfer that pressure into their support columns. That is how the Hiroshima Peace Dome survived, and remains a reminder of what happened there. But the critical part for us here is that much of the radiation just goes up into the atmosphere and spreads around the world. That is in contrast to a meltdown, where the radiation sticks into the ground. Hence, Chernobyl remains an exclusion zone, but Hiroshima never depopulated. Still, none of this is good for public health, never mind your own domestic political optics. That takes away using tactical nuclear weapons on Kursk to, defend Kursk. It also eliminates bombing anywhere along the Eastern Front, as Russia would like to occupy those areas immediately afterward, without extra obstacles. That leaves Ukraine staging grounds for the Kursk offensive, which would be fitting given the situation. However, Ukraine is doing this outside of Sumy, and winds in the area have a nasty tendency to go this way, that is, right into Belgorod Oblast. One final option is to simply test a nuclear weapon on Russian territory, as a means to try to signal the Kremlin's resolve on the matter. But that comes at the risk of political blowback from China and India, without directly affecting the military situation in Ukraine. Thus, as it stands, Ukraine occupied Kursk without fear of nuclear retribution. Meanwhile, if you want to avoid nuclear retaliation from me, I demand that you read my books on the war in Ukraine. Well, actually, you can avoid nuclear retaliation from me by not reading those books. It turns out that they have not trusted me with nuclear weapons. Not yet, anyway. So if you are voluntarily interested, check out the video description for more information. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.